People keep wondering why do I focus on Steve Isdall all the time? Well, it's nothing personal about him. It's that anyone who becomes a prominent voice in the study of this species needs to be held to account. So if he's going to peddle false information, I think people should stand up against that information. It's too bad that I seem to be the only one right now. I think more of us should do it. His video of just yesterday has already racked up 70,000 views, and probably a lot more by the time you see this video here. Steve Isdall is, I think, one of the two most influential voices on the scene right now, the other one being Carrie Arnold and Bigfoot Odyssey. If Carrie Arnold and Bigfoot Odyssey started putting out damaging falsehoods, I would darn well stand up against them too. It's a matter of principle. Anyway, today, however, I'm going to talk about something that Steve asked yesterday that is a very, very good and important question.
I mean, let's face it, these things, when you make eye contact with them, normally on average, they run like you are the devil, which is so confusing to me because it's just bizarre. I don't understand how something that outclasses us so much and is so intimidating and can basically end you or I in a decision. It's just so confusing to me, especially being a professional hunter and taking out all characteristics and traits of various game animals. It's just so bizarre to me to see that these things, these beings, these people, these whatever they are, will actually stalk in to intimately close proximity of us when they decide to. I mean, that's some huge confidence, right? But those same beings will absolutely run in terror, somewhat it might look like terror, when we make eye contact with them and look at them. It's just something so confusing there. And that's one of the mysteries that I would like to know, actually, eventually, is the whys. I want to know why they react the way they do.
I have some thoughts on this issue, this admittedly very mysterious aspect of Sasquatch behavior. It's just my own hypothesis. Others can offer theirs. But if you have interest in a possible explanation for this bizarre behavior, pull up a chair, grab yourself a big bucket of popcorn. Thank you. Some feel that Sasquatch are able to accomplish what they do by training, each generation teaching the next one how to be a successful Sasquatch. But when you think about how uniformly ingenious this species is at evading us and surviving, and then when you think about the nature of teaching and learning, this proposition seems to make little sense. It would require that all the teaching was just about equally perfect, and that all the learners were equally apt pupils. Sasquatch basically doesn't make big mistakes. They make little ones. They get caught out, and they quickly conceal themselves again. But they never make that fatal mistake, the one that would have irreversible consequences for the entire species. When we introduce conscious choice, free will into the equation, we must suppose that there would be a great deal more variation in the application of the lessons they had learned. So this must mean that their behavior, this mind-boggling immaculate success rate, is due to innate knowledge of how to do what they do. In that regard, then, can we say that it is all just instinct and that they're to be seen on the same plane as other animals who hide from us and know how to achieve remarkable camouflage and then simply evade us when we get too close? This idea might work, if not for one perplexing quality in this species. They don't just avoid us. They also come toward us, interact with us, make overtures toward us at many spots in North America and throughout the world that they've become familiar with. These spots are often called habituation sites. Sasquatch will peek in the window, will tap on the walls and on the glass. They'll throw pebbles up on the roof, slap the sides of the houses. They will knock on trees in the nearby woods. They'll even be visible, almost always at night, peeking from behind trees or swaying back and forth. They will take our belongings and return them maybe weeks or months later. They'll rearrange our things. A friend of mine used to routinely find her garden tools, such as rakes and hoes, relocated to 50 or 60 feet up in trees. For the book Our Life with Bigfoot, I was privileged to interview and in some cases to visit 6 families across North America. Some were thousands of miles apart, who were experiencing the very same suite of overtures without having compared notes whatsoever. One spot that I visited on numerous occasions was in East Texas, and here is where I got the woodpile Sasquatch footage. We had a big bonfire going, and occasionally I would step out from the firelight and scan the tree line with a thermal camera. I didn't realize what I had filmed until I was reviewing the footage later back home. You can see the Sasquatch's left hand here flicking its fingers several times, and its 2 large eyes peeking through an opening in this pile of lumber. It was apparently spying on us as we had fun by the bonfire roasting marshmallows and hot dogs. This 2-sided behavioral profile of evading us and coming toward us seems not to have a match anywhere else in the animal kingdom, certainly not among wild animals. Sasquatch is the only creature on Earth who is just like this, except for a certain kind of human being, which we'll get to soon. It's a strange project to try to infer the nature of the mind of a creature that we have never studied directly. But we, as a research community, have now built up enough raw data about their behavior that we can make extrapolations about their nature, the nature that lies behind this behavior. I mentioned before that there seems to be no other wild animal on Earth who both avoids humans so consistently and so consistently approaches us, but in an odd, indirect manner. Can we place this apparently unique, double-sided behavioral profile into some broader context? I think that we need a theory that can explain numerous features or facets of Sasquatch nature, all in one concept. And I'm interested to hear any of those. I have a theory that I've been working on for a couple of years that I'm tossing out there into the world. And it seizes upon the fact that we already have on the table a known constellation of traits, a known condition in nature, in evolution, that rises up within our fellow human beings quite frequently. And this is autism. It's not just autism, but a particular subset called autistic savantism. In this presentation, I'll be running through 10 parallels between Sasquatch nature as we can infer it and autistic savants as they demonstrate their genius. This conceptual framework of autistic savantism is a resource, and I think that we should take it and run with it as far as we can so that we can decide just how much it may contribute to our comprehension of this astonishing species. An autistic savant is an individual with autism who is exceptionally gifted in a specialized field, capable of complex mental calculations, photographic memory, and displaying a high degree of visual intelligence. It has come to me that Sasquatch must possess some version of this condition or this cluster of traits in order to be able to achieve what they do achieve on a daily basis, on a minute-by-minute basis throughout North America and elsewhere. Not recognizing the existence of Sasquatch, science has long conferred the status of our closest cousins to the chimpanzees and bonobos. We occasionally find autistic traits in these species, also in other higher primates. Autistic author Dawn Prince Hughes wrote a gorgeous book called Songs of the Gorilla Nation, in which she describes that throughout her childhood she was unable to make direct emotional connections with other human beings. It wasn't until she began working with gorillas at her local zoo that she for the first time felt able to commune with another living creature. She found that gorillas' way of being in time, being in space, and interacting with one another and with her was very much like her own style of being in the world. According to the DNA study by Melba Ketchum, Sasquatch is a hybrid between Homo sapiens and another primate as yet undiscovered, but probably a fellow member of the genus Homo with us. For a long time, the Neanderthal was the only other member of the Homo species that was known to have existed up until fairly recently. But just in 2010, the genome of another extinct close cousin was sequenced, that of the Denisovan. Neanderthal skull analysis has shown that the visual cortex of this species, there at the back of the skull, took up a much larger share of the brain than the visual cortex in our own species. Visual intelligence and the underdevelopment of social intelligence is a hallmark of autism. Of course, that is a highly circumstantial connection and requires a great deal more inquiry to solidify. Svante Pääbo, the Swedish geneticist and the world's foremost authority on extinct hominin DNA, has found that the fact that differences are seen between modern humans and Denisovans in terms of autism-linked genes is especially interesting. This finding, too, is only suggestive and doesn't prove anything, though some researchers are suggesting already that the perceptual and intellectual gifts associated with autism may represent an atavism, that is, a re-expression or resurgence of an ancient style of thinking. Autism is a highly heritable condition. It runs in families, and so in theory it's perfectly possible that it could run in species as well. I'm going to run through the top 10 parallels in no particular order. These will include both savant traits per se and autistic traits more broadly. In 1992, Donna Williams put out a groundbreaking memoir, a testimonial about the inside experience of being autistic. 10 years later, she released an even more intricate and rich account. In the latter book, she writes that as a child, I responded best to an underplaying of interest. My father used to call me Spook because of the way I hovered about and then disappeared when approached. People with autism tend to feel that they are always on the verge of being invaded by others, by the outside world. She terms this state of constantly feeling under siege exposure anxiety. Donna Williams writes, "The most effective means of turning down the invasion volume for a person with exposure anxiety is to talk to them through objects, interacting through an intermediary, which moves the focus off the person and onto the object. This form of communication is best practiced in digestible small doses that leave the person wanting more." At the Oklahoma habituation site that I worked with, it was a family affair. They would regularly bring food to a spot they called the monkey yard, and although they would never directly interact with their visitors, they would routinely interact with them indirectly, obliquely. One method of communication that they used was to leave stuffed animals on a particular bench in their yard. Sometimes these animals would be untouched, sometimes they would be strewn about in the morning, but more often there would be noticeable but very subtle changes. Here, a dragon character starts out face down and is found the next day to have been flipped over. One night, small Sasquatches were heard and fleetingly seen running around the yard. The children of the house chased them in vain. The woman of the house had a camera, and although it was too dark to really see the figures, she heard one right behind the bench and snapped this shot. Brightening the image later brought out about a 3-foot-tall individual, holding in his or her hand one of the little teddy bears that had been left on the bench. Other habituators throughout the continent and elsewhere in the world typically leave stone and stick structures in certain spots on their property. Some call these glyphs. Sometimes the next day and sometimes weeks or months later, these are rearranged as a kind of response, a mediated conversation. One time a few years ago, I was having a good deal of Sasquatch activity. I had knocking on the side of my house in the middle of the night. I had a stuffed animal suddenly appear in an apple tree. I had wood knocks in the back forest. And I would also leave arrangements of stones in a particular spot. And in time, they would be rearranged. So I kept wanting more. I left food. I added more stones. I kept checking every day. And I think that just as Donna Williams was mentioning, I was trying too hard. I was coming on too strong. Instead of underplaying my interest, I was overplaying and not using small doses. So what happened was, he or she, the visitor, threw me a wild curveball instead. Well, this is pretty interesting. I just discovered that my antenna is down inside here. It took me a little while to realize that this formation of the antenna was an exact duplicate of the tree bends that I and others find all the time in Sasquatch territory. Pinned down just like those tree bends. To get that down in there. See, already I feel like I'm going to snap it. I don't want to push it. Look for more examples of this sly, pranking kind of humor ahead. Farther.
It is the immediate repetition of words or short phrases by autistic people. So immediately after somebody says something to us or we hear it, we repeat it. Delayed echolalia is exactly what it sounds like. It's the repetition of words or phrases after a period of time. I see this kind of echolalia, this delayed echolalia, quite a bit in autistic teenagers and adults. An autistic person's use of delayed echolalia could very well be an attempt to communicate or to express themselves or interact. But again, like immediate echolalia, delayed echolalia is also used by autistic people just for ourselves. It can be self-stimulatory or soothing to us.
In my book, The Sasquatch Savant Theory, I've reprinted from Our Life with Bigfoot many instances of echolalia that people have experienced in relation to Sasquatch. Again, these accounts come from people hundreds and thousands of miles apart who have not compared notes with one another. They just shared their experiences with me at the time. In North Carolina, the habituator writes, "They imitate my son and say, 'Mom,' loudly. They can sound just like him. I thought he was playing tricks until they did it when I was here alone." In Oklahoma, we have, on many occasions, one of the kids will be outside and come running in asking, "Did you call me?" I've been working in the gardens or sitting outside and have heard a child's voice call, "Mom!" It sounds just like one of my kids. This has happened many times over the years when I was home alone. In Iowa, they mimic our voices too, all the time, just to mess with us. The grandchildren will say, "We heard you hollering for us," and I'll say, "Oh, yeah, I just don't want to scare them." At one spot in Texas, and they imitate my mom and say, "Rachel," all the time. They will act like they are my dogs crying far away, and as soon as I get far, far away looking for the dogs, they say, "Rachel," back at the house. Then when I get to the house, my mom's not even home. Then they make the dog noise again, making me run back over and over till I have to give up. In another spot in Texas, 80 miles from the first spot, then there was the voice trick. The girls would be at school and I would hear, "Mom," from the woods, and I'd think, that couldn't be the girls because they're at school, etc., etc., etc. Not only do they mimic human voices, but so many people report hearing them mimic birds, but 300-pound chickadees, for instance, incredibly loud, and also birds that in the dark will run on 2 feet from one place to another and make the loud, loud call again. They imitate house cats. When the cat is inside, it'll sound like it's in the woods. People have heard motorcycles suddenly coming to life in the thick, thick woods where there's no roads or any people. It just goes on, the range of what they're able to mimic. The woman at the second Texas site says, "I think they just sit up in the trees, and this is their entertainment. Watch this one, watch that one," like they're playing a prank.
It could be situational and just for fun.
What I'm going to play for you in this section is a specific kind of percussion, rhythmic drumming riffs. But when we step back and think of the nature of Sasquatch percussion itself, we have to ask ourselves why they use this at all. It's pretty clear that they would understand, that we would have to understand, that no other animal except them makes this kind of very clear impact of wood on wood, or stone on stone, or stone on wood. It would be much, much safer for them if they would communicate with one another through other kinds of sounds that they're very well known to be able to make, such as animal mimicry, bird songs, squirrel sounds, canid howls and barks. We'd have to suppose that they'd be able to accomplish the communication they need to accomplish with signals that would be ambiguous to human beings. Woodnocks are not. Therefore, we can only conclude that percussion is deep-seated in them, hardwired in their nature, as it is very frequently in autistic people. Not just impacts, but rhythm, rhythmic rocking, rhythmic swaying, rhythmic movement of the hands and head. For 9 years, I have been researching in a ravine just 2 miles from my house. One from over there. On the morning of August 17th, 2015, I managed to film one of the sometime residents of this ravine, but I didn't know it at the time. He or she was only 87 feet from me, but I was too distracted by the coyote who came toward me and appeared right before me. Later review of the footage turned up a small figure behind a 4-foot-tall, pretty sparse pine tree. But here again, I didn't realize what I was filming at the time. One day I decided to leave my recorder from the morning when I left at 8 o'clock until late in the afternoon. Though I scoured the internet and posted many inquiries online, I couldn't find a similar instance of Sasquatch audio for almost 2 years, until a friend put me onto a researcher in Massachusetts.
So stimming is a repetitive motion that one tends to do over and over again. The most common form being like the hand flapping or rocking back and forth. Sometimes, like a tapping a pencil can be a stimming behavior.
And you've been sitting for 2 hours and you don't know what you're going to do, you can self-regulate by rocking in your desk, by rubbing something like the rubbery end of an eraser, twirling your hair, tapping something against the side of your face. You can fidget with a fidget toy. All of these things, you can focus on the good sensory input, focus on one thing, and the rest of the world, it fades away. The second reason is sensory seeking. Seeking sensory input and just really enjoying it.
This particular day, the drumming went on, and I have no reason to assume that this day was atypical. I think that in Sasquatch, we have a population with very limited options and a whole lot of time on their hands. Just this past August, I recorded a different version of what seems to me the same drumming signature. We're all familiar with hundreds and hundreds of examples of stick and tree structures that people have found and documented throughout North America. And everyone wonders, what do they mean? I think we need to distinguish between referential and non-referential meaning. Referential meaning would include structures that point to water or hunting areas or define boundaries between family groups. There may be many meanings. But if I'm right about this parallel with autism, then many other kinds of structures are simply an expression of the desire to make order out of one's environment, to contour the woods in a pleasing and reassuring manner, so that if you're a Sasquatch, everywhere you look, you find emblems of yourself, a kind of world within the world that feels like home. In Songs of the Gorilla Nation, Don Prince Hughes writes that as a child, quote, I gained some relief by arranging things. Most autistic people need order and ritual and will find ways to make order where they feel chaos. This wheel formation, which makes use of a still-rooted tree as one of its spokes, I found in the same ravine where I recorded all the knocking and drumming and filmed the little guy. Here is a young autistic girl who is overwhelmed by her need to create order. Now, I'm not trying to imply here that Sasquatch will throw a tantrum. I'm not trying to infantilize the species. If anything, compared to them, we're more like children. But these behaviors tend to be more clear in young people, and video examples of them are more easily available. Here we see the overriding importance of creating order and gaining control in a world that otherwise feels chaotic and insecure.
It's all right, Charlie. Look, there.
I found they were laid along a log, and they happened to be on the same trail that I recorded the wood knocks on. I recommend Colorado Bigfoot's YouTube channel. He is finding some spectacular areas up in the mountains around where he lives.
And look what they're about to do. Look at that. They dragged all of that stuff. You know, this is why I go with Chris Noel's thing on autism, because, you know, he really someone took a lot of care in getting those sticks. I know it sounds crazy, but a lot of time. I'm talking, they're almost all identical. You would have had to walk all over this forest to get those sticks.
5 sticks, possibly 6 here, all purposely laid on the log.
In upstate New York, some of us came across this old stone wall that had trees and limbs laid parallel along it. This pattern went on for maybe 100 yards, a long way down the wall, sometimes in a very regular cross-hatching pattern.
All he wants to do is line things up No more lining up. Let's color with paper, please. Let me see, make a pretty picture.
Her lining up things of my 4-year-old has gotten pretty extreme. Some classical signs of autism.
A very typical autistic behavior is swaying and rocking. Another form of self-soothing or self-stimulation, also called stimming.
And I started seeing some red eye shine, some gold eye shine back out in here, and then just below me right here, something just ran right through here really fast. And I look over this way, and just right over here, maybe 30 to 40 feet, I can see what looks like, it's totally black, it's dark, but there's like this brownish shadow that appears to be upright, and it's rocking back and forth right over here. And it's like, okay, is that really there? Is that just shadows? So I'm kind of sitting here and I'm looking around and I'm trying not to look over there and I'm looking up at the stars and I'm kind of glancing back over there. Yeah, it's still there. And I'm looking around and I'm trying not to look over there. And every time I look back over there, it's still just right over here, just kind of rocking back and forth, rocking back and forth.
Autistic people seldom make direct eye contact. They employ all sorts of methods of avoiding interaction that seems too close, too invasive. One of these methods is simply to stare off into space. Back in the day, in the mid-70s, when John Green was first compiling his books full of eyewitness testimonials about Sasquatch encounters, John Napier was doing the same thing. These men interviewed many hundreds. A frequent comment is that when observed, the creature stands and stares, expressionless.
Another kind of mind is the pattern thinker, more abstract. These are your engineers, your computer programmers. Now this is pattern thinking. That praying mantis is made from a single sheet of paper. No scotch tape, no cuts, and there in the background is the pattern for folding it. The animal mind, and also my mind, puts sensory-based information into categories. I take all the little pieces and I put the pieces together like a puzzle.
Sasquatch must possess strategic, tactical genius, practical wisdom, because from their point of view, I believe, they are always behind enemy lines and must exercise terrain management that will allow them to evade us. In order to pull this off day after day, for centuries, for millennia, I think they have to be every bit as gifted as a chess grandmaster and as Stephen Wiltshire.
His nickname is the Living Camera. When he was 11, he drew a perfect aerial view of London after only one helicopter ride. Even the number of windows in all the major buildings in his drawing was correct. We're testing the Living Camera in Rome. After only a 45-minute helicopter flight, we'll ask him to draw a 5.5-yard panoramic picture of the historic city centre, without having a second glance at it. Stephen was also accurate in the instances we checked of nameless buildings and side streets. Had he had more time, he would have put in even more detail.
To quote Temple Grandin again, I'd go so far as to say that animals might actually be autistic savants. So here, we're not talking about this condition as it might specifically manifest itself in the primate family tree, but rather as it might be distributed very naturally throughout the animal kingdom.
The shy bird called Clark's nutcracker collects food during the growing season and stores it for the cold winter months. In 1 year, a bird will store between 22,000 and 33,000 seeds in as many as 2,500 locations, which can be more than 10 miles apart.
First test. Can chimpanzees count from 1 to 9 in the right order in return for a peanut or other tasty reward? Yes, they can. Now, if you just flash the 9 numerals for a moment, then cover them, can a chimpanzee remember where each numeral was and still get the order they were in right? Yes, for another tasty treat. This chimp got this wrong once, but thought nothing of it and, undaunted, went right back to getting them all correct. Just keep the goodies coming. Now, can another primate species, the adult Homo sapien, do the same? Well, okay. And again? Again? Again?
It seems to me that when we try to trick them, to leave cameras or to outsmart them within their territory, they just think and run circles around us. Even a camera that's much better hidden than this one would probably be for them as though for us somebody had defecated on our living room rug. It would jump right out at them. They have to be equipped with this sort of cognition. Otherwise, our bloodthirsty species would have put an end to them or captured them centuries ago. Three months ago, I was on an expedition in southern Vermont, about 90 miles from here, and 7 of us were walking a dark road, and we turned randomly into a field. We thought it was a field. It was a swamp and field combination, and less than a minute after we entered this field, we hear off to our left, "Woo!" It was thrilling, and it came right from the middle of a dense clump of trees, about 150, 200 feet away across a band of swamp water. It was a perfect castle moat situation where he had a place to conceal himself, and there was a literal moat, and we couldn't get to him. He was completely safe. One of us had a thermal camera, and we took turns scanning this stand of trees, and not once during the whole 45-minute encounter did we see a single indication of his body heat. He knocked on trees, he threw big somethings, either tree limbs or rocks, into the water like a splash, and he stayed hidden even though it was nighttime and even though he couldn't have known how thermal cameras work. This is the thing about them. They just are made out of hiding from deep in their bones. He could have easily stepped out to get a better look at us or to get a different angle. I think that for a Sasquatch, suddenly finding yourself against your will and by mistake out in the open in front of human beings and their eyes is as unnatural for them as if we suddenly found ourselves naked 50 feet underwater. It's just the opposite of our element.
I worked in a group home. It was just a regular home with, the halls were a little bit wider for wheelchairs.
This is my friend Michael. He worked at a group home in Alaska for 20 years with autistic folks. People on the autistic spectrum tend to employ very, very sophisticated maneuvers to avoid letting their true self be seen and known. Because, again, at bottom, they're afraid of invasion, of being overwhelmed or snuffed out. Sasquatch, it seems to me, does the very same thing, but on the physical level, with their bodies. But here's a case in which an autistic person seems to emulate this kind of Sasquatch genius at being scarce, yet nearby.
And I knew that this particular individual was in the house. He could only be a few places. And you had a sense that, yes, they are there. I heard him like 5 minutes ago. I know he's in here. And searched the house head to toe, and they're not in there. I mean, systematically go through each room in a clockwise fashion, knowing that there's no way, through. Could not find that individual whatsoever. I never could figure it out. He'd just end up on the couch. You'd walk out and say, I'm finished, and he'd be on the couch, or he'd be standing in the kitchen, or he'd be standing behind you.
This would seem to fly in the face of what I said earlier about how they avoid direct contact and only go for oblique interactions. The key here, though, is control. When it's on their own terms, they will sometimes present themselves, albeit very briefly. There is an analog to this within autism. It is like they have an on-off switch, sometimes overactive in seeking stimulation. They are often called sensory seekers. And back to Donna Williams from Exposure Anxiety, autistic buzz junkies have an adrenaline addiction that can drive thrill-seeking behaviors and the rush that goes with them. This manic, euphoric high is like jumping from a height. So when we think of Sasquatch scaring people, don't forget that they could also be trying to scare themselves. Some report that the reason they do this is that they want to exert force and power and assert control and dominance. This is another way of overcoming the vulnerability that they so often feel. And of course, Sasquatch researchers typically find trees that have been treated very violently. So, people think Sasquatch are monsters. I think that they're, in a way, the opposite of monsters. Instead of being like some bull in a china shop, they're more like overgrown geeks, like OCD, like very focused on fine details of their physical surroundings, their own actions. They know our behavior, our daily routines better than we do, in a way. They need to be able to anticipate and to memorize everything that we do in order to do what they do. Instead of being monsters, I think they're easily destabilized and vulnerable and anxious. And so everything that we see them do, or most of it, is in response to that basic state of being. The only way that they can survive and combat what would otherwise be domineering fellow species in us is to be masterfully in control. We all learned in school that the reason our species, Homo sapiens, was able to be successful in evolution and conquer all the competitors and win the day is that we were able to form societies and cooperate and grow and get more complex socially. Autism, of course, seems to be the opposite of that. It's an antisocial kind of condition. I think that Sasquatch has a version of autism. It's not exactly like human autism, and this same quality that is shared to some extent by animals in general, a primal genius, all goes back to some very ancient root and manifests itself somewhat differently in different species. I think that in the Sasquatch version, small groups, small cells of individuals are sort of like oneself. That instead of an individual feeling at odds or alienated from all others, as human autistic people often do and struggle to overcome, I think that the small family groups and maybe larger clans are like an extension of the self, and that human beings are the other, the bringer of chaos, the great overarching threat to their way of life. And I think that whereas other competitors like the Neanderthals and perhaps the Denisovans and probably many others that we have not yet discovered attempted to compete with us on the same playing field by being in larger social groups and were thus either vanquished or partially genetically absorbed into our genome, the Sasquatch went under the radar on a completely different playing field. Not going down the same pathway at all, not using fire. Fire, of course, is not rocket science, but it became rocket science. It became all the technology and progress that we have achieved. Sasquatch doesn't have any need of civilization. It seems to have found its ideal niche. It's their limitations that are as key to their success as are their capacities.
You see, the autistic mind tends to be a specialist mind, good at one thing, bad at something else.
This reminds me of what my friend at the East Texas habituation site once said. They fit with humans like gears. What humans lack, these people possess. What these people lack, humans possess.